She thought she was helping a man rebuild his life, but in the end, she never saw it coming. A quiet town, a kind-hearted woman, a man with a past that few truly understood. It was a crime that shocked everyone, a brutal act of violence in a place where things like this weren't supposed to happen. But the truth? This wasn't just a random tragedy. It was something far worse. Because the person responsible for this crime? He had done it before. And yet he was free. Clydach, Wales, a small, peaceful community where people looked out for each other, a place where crimes like this didn't happen. At least that's what everyone thought. But in August of 2022, that illusion was shattered. Inside her own home, a woman lay lifeless. The scene was one of unimaginable brutality, the kind of violence that didn't happen in a quiet town like this, the kind that left people asking, why? But the real question wasn't just about what happened. It was about who did it. And when the truth came out, it was even more chilling than the crime itself, because this wasn't the first time. The person responsible had been behind bars before. He had taken lives before. And yet, despite everything, he was back on the streets, free to do it again. How did this happen? Who decided that he was safe enough to be released? The signs were there. The warnings were clear. But still, no one stopped him. For some, this case was just another horrific tragedy. But for others, it was a failure. A deep, unsettling failure of the system that was supposed to protect people. And the scariest part, if it happened once, it could happen again. Because for every person like him who gets caught, how many more are out there, walking free, slipping through the cracks? Was this just a terrible mistake? Or was it something much bigger? Something that points to a system broken beyond repair? A system that let him out? A system that told the world he was no longer dangerous? A system that left an innocent woman completely vulnerable? And it's not the first time this has happened. It makes you wonder, how many others are out there? Because if one man with a past as dark as his could be released so easily, who else has been let go? Stay with us as we pull back the curtain on a story that never should have happened. Welcome to Unmasked, the channel you come to hear the shocking and the believable. Subscribe for more true crime stories that are actually true. It was the kind of night where nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least not at first. The streets were dark, the town quiet, and inside a small home, 3 men sat together. They had known each other for years. Friends, brothers, drinking buddies. But by morning, 2 of them would be dead. And the third, he would become the center of a gruesome crime scene, one that would haunt the town for decades to come. Before we dive into that night, let's go back. Who was Brian Whitelock before the murders? For some, he was just another face in town, not particularly remarkable, but not completely invisible either. A man with a short temper and a history of trouble, though nothing, at least not yet, suggested the depths of violence he was capable of. Born and raised in Wales, Whitelock grew up in an environment that shaped him in all the worst ways. He wasn't the type of person who kept close, long-term friendships. His interactions with people were often strained, erratic, and at times explosive. Those who knew him sensed something was off, but back then, no one could have predicted how far it would go. Then came 2001. It started as a normal evening. Drinking, talking, laughter. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. Tensions that no one fully understood until it was too late. Brian Whitelock was at the home of Nicholas Morgan, a man he had considered a friend. Also present that night was Glenn Whitelock, Brian's own brother. What set Whitelock off that night remains a mystery. Maybe it was alcohol. Maybe it was an argument that spiraled out of control. Maybe it was something darker, something that had been brewing inside him for years, just waiting for the right moment to explode. But what we do know is this: by the time the night was over, Nicholas Morgan was dead. The weapon? A hammer. Blunt force trauma. A frenzied, relentless attack. The kind of violence that suggests one thing: rage. And Whitelock wasn't done. With Nicholas Morgan's body lying in the home, Whitelock made a decision that turned an already horrific crime into something even worse. He needed to hide the evidence, so he set the house on fire. But what he failed to consider was that his own brother, Glenn Whitelock, was still inside. The flames spread quickly, the smoke thick and suffocating. Glenn never made it out. He died not from the fire itself, but from smoke inhalation, his lungs filling with the toxic fumes before he had a chance to escape. 2 men, 2 lives lost, 1 night of unimaginable violence. And Brian Whitelock? He walked away. It didn't take long for authorities to piece together what had happened. The fire was suspicious, too deliberate, too convenient, and when investigators arrived at the scene, the horror of what had truly happened that night began to unfold. Nicholas Morgan hadn't died in the fire. His body told a different story, the hammer wounds, the brutal force used against him. It was clear, this wasn't an accident. It was murder. And all eyes turned to the one man who had both motive and opportunity, Brian Whitelock. His arrest was swift. He didn't have an alibi. He didn't have an explanation that made sense. And as the evidence stacked against him, one thing became painfully obvious. He wasn't just a man who had lost control. He was a killer. The courtroom was filled with a mix of anger, grief, and disbelief. The prosecution painted a picture of a dangerous, unpredictable man, someone with a short temper and a violent streak, someone who had no remorse for what he had done. The evidence was clear: the hammer attack, the deliberate arson, the tragic, unnecessary death of Glenn Whitelock, caught in the flames of his brother's crime. Whitelock's defense? He claimed he never intended for things to go that far, that it was a moment of rage, a terrible mistake. But mistakes don't look like this. Mistakes don't involve multiple blows with a hammer. Mistakes don't involve setting an entire house on fire to destroy the evidence. And the jury knew it. The sentence came down, life in prison. For many, it seemed like justice had been served. A man capable of such brutality, deception, and destruction had been taken off the streets, locked away where he could never do harm again. Or so they thought. Because what no one realized back then was that this wouldn't be the end of Brian Whitelock's story. Not even close. For years, Brian Whitelock sat behind bars. No one expected to see him free again. But somehow, despite everything, despite the lives he had taken, despite the violence he had unleashed, the system decided he was no longer a threat. And when the time came, they let him go. And that's where the real tragedy begins. For nearly 2 decades, Brian Whitelock sat behind bars. The outside world had moved on. His name had faded from the headlines. The brutal killings he committed in 2001 had become just another closed case, another tragic crime buried in time. But then, in 2019, something happened. The prison doors opened, and Brian Whitelock walked free. A man who had killed not once, but twice. A man who had bludgeoned a friend to death with a hammer and then set fire to a home, killing his own brother in the process, was suddenly back on the streets. But how? How does a man like Whitelock go from a life sentence to a second chance at freedom? The answer is as chilling as the crime itself. Most people assumed Whitelock would die in prison. He had been given a life sentence after all. That should have been the end of his story. But in the complex, often flawed world of criminal justice, life doesn't always mean life. After serving just 18 years, Whitelock became eligible for parole. And despite the horrific nature of his crimes, despite the brutality of his actions, despite the fact that he had shown no mercy to his victims, the parole board deemed him fit for release. They called him low risk. Let that sink in. A man who had once been so consumed with rage that he bludgeoned a man to death and then set a house on fire was now being described as low risk. Their reasoning? Good behavior behind bars. Psychological evaluations that suggested he had changed. No major incidents during his time in prison. But here's the problem. Prison is controlled. A man like Whitelock wasn't walking free in the outside world. He was locked up, monitored, contained. A controlled environment is not the same as rehabilitation. Yet in 2019, the system took a gamble, and they lost. The conditions of Whitelock's release were simple. He was to resettle quietly and rebuild his life. He had strict parole monitoring, at least on paper. He was not supposed to pose a threat to anyone. With no immediate family to turn to, no strong social connections, he moved to Clydach, a small, quiet town in Wales. It wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors at night. It was safe, or so they believed. The kind of town where everyone knew each other, where people believed in giving others a chance. And unfortunately, that included Brian Whitelock. When Whitelock arrived in Clydach, he didn't stand out. Not at first. There was no grand announcement, no news reports warning the town that a double murderer had just moved in among them. Instead, he blended in. He found a small place to live, he kept to himself, and to most people, he was just another quiet neighbour. But one person took notice. One person saw Whitelock not as a danger, but as someone in need of help. Her name was Wendy Buckney. Wendy Buckney had lived in Clydach for years. She was known for being kind-hearted, generous, and always willing to help others. She saw the good in people, even when no one else did. And when she met Brian Whitelock, she saw a man who, in her eyes, had served his time and deserved a second chance. What she didn't see were the warning signs. She didn't see the parole board's mistake. She didn't see the danger lurking beneath the surface. She didn't see what was coming. What she did see was a man who needed work, a man who needed a chance to prove he could be better. So she hired him for odd jobs. She welcomed him into her home. She ignored the quiet warnings from others. And for the community at first, no one thought much of him. To most, he was just another man trying to get by. But there were whispers. Some people in town knew something about his past, even if they didn't know all the details. And to those who were paying attention, there was something unsettling about him. But no one wanted to believe the worst. After all, if the parole board thought he was safe, he had to be safe. Right? Right? The last thing Wendy Buckney ever expected was that her kindness would cost her life. She wasn't the type to judge. She wasn't the type to turn her back on someone who needed help. What happened next would shock the town and expose the fatal mistake that allowed a killer to walk free. Because, just like before, it was only a matter of time before Whitelock's violent nature resurfaced. In 2019, Brian Whitelock, a man previously convicted of 2 violent deaths, was released from prison after serving 18 years of his life sentence. Despite the brutality of his crimes, the parole board deemed him a low-risk offender, allowing him to reintegrate into society. Whitelock settled in Clydach, Wales, a quiet community where few were aware of his past. While he initially kept a low profile, several warning signs began to emerge, indicators that, in hindsight, painted a clear picture of a man not fit for release. According to various reports, Whitelock's behaviour raised concerns early on, particularly in relation to his substance abuse issues. A history of alcohol and drug problems. Prior to his initial conviction, Whitelock was known to have issues with alcohol and possible drug use, contributing to his volatile and violent tendencies. A relapse after release. Following his return to society, it was noted that Whitelock began drinking again, a troubling sign considering his history of violence while under the influence. Though no formal complaints were made, some individuals in Clydach noted that Whitelock appeared unstable. His unpredictable temperament was a cause for unease, though many dismissed these concerns due to the lack of any direct incidents. He didn't seem like someone who had turned his life around, said one Clydach resident who asked to remain anonymous. He looked lost, like he had no purpose, no real plans. Unlike many high-profile cases where a dangerous individual is released under strict public monitoring, Whitelock's presence in Clydach was largely unknown to the general public. No public warnings. There were no public alerts, community meetings or statements made to inform residents that a convicted murderer was now living among them. No immediate incidents. Because Whitelock did not initially engage in any illegal activities, there was no immediate cause for concern from law enforcement. A false sense of security. With no police reports or public warnings, many assumed he was simply a former inmate trying to rebuild his life. However, despite the lack of formal complaints, there were whispers of concern among those who interacted with him. One of the individuals who crossed paths with Whitelock was 71-year-old Wendy Buckney, a well-known and respected member of the Clydach community. Buckney was known for her generosity and had a history of helping those in need, including those who had fallen on hard times. It was this very nature that led her to offer Whitelock small jobs, hiring him for handyman work and errands. She was not aware of his full criminal history, a critical factor that influenced her decision to trust him. Sources close to Buckney later revealed that she had been warned about Whitelock by friends and family, who urged her to keep a distance. She didn't see him as dangerous, a family friend stated. She believed everyone deserved a second chance. Despite concerns from those around her, Buckney continued to engage with Whitelock, seemingly unaware that she was placing herself in serious danger. As details emerged following Buckney's death, many questioned whether enough was done to monitor Whitelock post-release. Risk assessment failures, the parole board deemed him low risk, despite his past offences involving extreme violence and premeditated actions. Lack of local law enforcement oversight. While Whitelock was released under standard parole conditions, it remains unclear whether authorities adequately monitored his reintegration process. No immediate response to early concerns. There were informal concerns from locals, yet no reports were made to the authorities, suggesting either a lack of communication between the community and law enforcement or a failure to recognize potential warning signs. Many now wonder, could this tragedy have been prevented if stricter post-release supervision had been in place? A timeline of missed red flags. 2019, Whitelock's release. After serving 18 years, Brian Whitelock is deemed low risk and released on parole. Resettlement in Clydach. Whitelock moves into the community with little public knowledge of his past crimes. 2021, first signs of trouble. Reports suggest he resumed drinking, a behaviour that previously led to his violent tendencies. Some locals feel uneasy around him but do not formally report any incidents. 2022. Contact with Wendy Buckney. Buckney, unaware of his criminal past, hires Whitelock for odd jobs. Despite warnings from family and friends, she continues to trust him. August 2022. The tragedy. Buckney is found murdered in her home. Whitelock is arrested and later convicted. The case of Brian Whitelock has sparked a national discussion on how the justice system handles the release of violent offenders. As the debate continues, one fact remains clear. A woman who trusted the system lost her life because of it. And now the question is whether lessons will be learned or if history will repeat itself. The murder of Wendy Buckney. In August 2022, the tranquil village of Clydach near Swansea, Wales, was shattered by the brutal murder of 71-year-old Wendy Buckney. Her neighbour, 57-year-old Brian Lyndon Whitelock, who had previously been convicted of murder and manslaughter, was arrested and later sentenced to a whole life term for her killing. On the evening of August 22, 2022, Whitelock visited Buckney's flat. The following morning, a neighbour who sensed something was wrong confronted Whitelock, who admitted to killing Buckney. Responding officers found Buckney's naked and blood-stained body in her living room. The severity of her injuries indicated a prolonged and violent assault. The investigation revealed that Whitelock used multiple household items as weapons during the attack. Kitchen knife inflicted multiple stab wounds. Broken table leg used to deliver blunt force trauma. Wooden shelving employed as an improvised weapon. The combination of these weapons resulted in extensive injuries, including fractures and deep lacerations. Investigators described the crime scene as one of the most brutal they had encountered. The nature of the injuries and the apparent sexual assault suggested a prolonged and sadistic attack. Following his confession to a neighbour, Whitelock was arrested without resistance. During initial interrogations, he admitted to the killing, but later attempted to claim diminished responsibility, citing a brain injury. However, psychiatric evaluations determined that his actions were more likely influenced by drug intoxication. Authorities quickly connected Whitelock to the crime through his own admissions and forensic evidence linking him to the scene. In December 2024, the legal proceedings against Brian Whitelock culminated in a trial that drew significant public attention due to the brutal nature of the crime and Whitelock's criminal history. The trial not only sought justice for the victim, Wendy Buckney, but also highlighted critical discussions about the criminal justice system's handling of repeat offenders. At the outset of the trial, Whitelock admitted to killing Buckney, but denied the charge of murder, pleading guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He claimed that a brain injury, coupled with intoxication from substances like Valium and alcohol, impaired his mental functioning at the time of the offence. This defence aimed to reduce his culpability by suggesting that his capacity to understand his actions was significantly diminished. The prosecution, led by Christopher Rees KC, refuted Whitelock's claims of diminished responsibility. They presented psychiatric evidence indicating that his actions were more likely influenced by voluntary intoxication rather than any brain injury. The prosecution emphasized the calculated and violent nature of the crime, noting that Whitelock used multiple weapons, a kitchen knife, a broken table leg, and wooden shelving, to inflict severe injuries over an extended period. They also highlighted the sexual assault aspect of the crime, suggesting a sadistic motive. Furthermore, the prosecution drew parallels between this incident and Whitelock's previous offences in 2000, where he murdered Nicholas Morgan and caused the death of his brother Glenn during a drug-fueled episode. They argued that the similarities demonstrated a pattern of extreme violence under the influence, undermining the defence's argument of diminished responsibility. During the sentencing phase, the court heard poignant victim impact statements from Buckney's family. Her sister, Anne, described Wendy as a lovely, kind person who was bubbly and caring. She expressed the family's profound grief and trauma, stating that they were devastated that our much-loved sister, aunt and friend has been taken away so tragically. The family emphasized Wendy's positive impact on countless lives and the irreplaceable void her death had left. On December 20th, 2024, at Swansea Crown Court, Mr. Justice Griffiths sentenced Whitelock to a whole life order, ensuring he would never be eligible for parole. The judge described the attack as a frenzy of violence, noting that Buckney suffered a brutal, terrifying death. He highlighted that Whitelock was under the influence of Valium and alcohol during the crime, and that he derived pleasure and sexual satisfaction from the act. The judge also referenced Whitelock's previous convictions, stating that the murder was committed while he was on life license for the earlier offences. He concluded that Whitelock presented risks that could never be safely managed in the community, making a whole life order appropriate. The sentencing brought a mixture of relief and sorrow to Buckney's family and the Clydach community. While they were grateful for the justice served, the loss of Wendy remained a profound wound. The family expressed hope that the verdict would bring some measure of closure, allowing them to grieve and honour Wendy's memory. A grave misjudgment by the Parole Board. Whitelock's criminal history is marked by extreme violence. In 2001, he was convicted for the murder of Nicholas Morgan and the manslaughter of his own brother, Glenn Whitelock. Despite these convictions, he was released on parole in 2018 after serving 18 years of a life sentence. The Parole Board deemed him a low risk, a decision that has since come under intense scrutiny. The assessment considered factors such as Whitelock's behaviour during incarceration and his participation in rehabilitation programs. However, critics argue that his history of substance abuse and violent behaviour should have warranted a more cautious approach. The Parole Board's decision has been labelled a grave misjudgment, especially considering Whitelock's subsequent actions. Several red flags were evident following Whitelock's release. In December 2020, he was recalled to prison after assaulting a shop worker, but was released again in October 2021. Neighbors reported concerns about his erratic behavior, and there were instances where emergency services were contacted due to his condition. Despite these warning signs, effective interventions were lacking.
For the murder of Wendy Buckney, I sentence you to imprisonment for life. This is a case of the most extreme gravity. I have no doubt that the seriousness of this murder is so exceptionally high that just punishment requires you to be kept in prison for the rest of your life, and you will never be considered for parole.
B Tandacoy Road for possible murder, please.
What do you mean a possible murder?
Brian Whitelock, who I've just reported missing, has come out of the girl's house and he said he's killed her.
In the course of the night, you inflicted a frenzy of violence on her, which caused her to die a brutal, terrifying death.
Should Whitelock have ever been released? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this case eye-opening, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more well-researched true crime stories. We uncover the facts, unmask the failures, and give you the details the headlines miss. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.